pretty small font size. For those of you in the back, you may actually want to come to the front on this to catch some of the content on the slides here. So as you mentioned, I'll be talking about single stair. I was at a conference last week in Victoria for the Home Builders Association, and they said I need to just stop introducing myself as Conrad Speckert and just call myself Mr. Single Stair. I'm not sure if I'm going to start doing that, but they do have a point. I'll talk a bit, so I came to the Missing Middle Summit 3-4 years ago now and talked about single stair, and at the time I don't think anyone in the room knew what the hell I was talking about. I'll just raise the question, how many of you know what single stair is, or at least think you do at this point? Yeah, that's the power of LinkedIn and shit posting relentlessly. So let's go to the next slide. I'll just add that if anything I say you miss or you want to really nerd out about this at my level, there's a website called singlestair.ca. For the last year and a half, we've been working on a research project that was funded by CMHC called the Housing Supply Challenge to actually develop single stair buildings across Canada. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the code change and the work that has been going on for the last 3-4 years, and then also the most recent research project, which is really about trying to do this on the ground. Next slide. So, of course, all of you know what the missing middle is, why this is important, why we're talking about this now, and why perhaps 20 years ago it did not receive the attention that it does today. So a typical apartment building in Canada, and certainly any 60-unit apartment building that you might be looking at, generally is a 2-staircase building design, a long hallway down the middle that we call a double-loaded corridor, an elevator core in the middle, and you end up with a configuration where, except for the 4 corners of the building, you've got shoebox units. You've got units that have windows on one side. They're relying more on mechanical ventilation. You end up with some inboard bedrooms. You do things like dens and walk-in closets to fill that wasted space at the back you don't know what to do with. You end up in a situation where it's pretty much impossible to tell the difference between a hotel and an apartment building, where you've got up to 100 or 200 mailboxes on the ground floor, and it sets up a path dependency in the design of these buildings. Next slide. When we're talking about single stair, it is not that building with one exit stair. It is a fundamentally different type of building design. You're looking at very short travel distances to the exit stair. You've got a maximum of 4 units on each floor level. And so that means that you might only have 20 mailboxes. You might actually know your neighbors. The amount of time you'd be waiting for that elevator is drastically reduced because you've got less people you're sharing your building with. And this is basic apartment building design 101 around the world, not in Canada. Next slide. And so the goal of single stair design is threefold. And just to spell out the obvious, it's to make missing middle and mid-rise housing easier to build, which of course makes the development of small sites. Large sites are still going to be done as double-loaded corridor buildings, but small sites right now may not be feasible. It's to make those designs actually feasible. And what that of course is, as a knock-on effect, is that small-scale development becomes possible without the large amounts of capital required for land assembly and to acquire large properties. Next slide. And so in our code, we have a national building code. It's being harmonized to provincial building codes, and then there's Vancouver as a chartered city, which has its own building code, but they all say in 342 or Part 9, 998, that says if you've got a building of more than 2 stories, you need 2 exit stairs. Next slide. This is the work that I was known for 3-4 years ago, was to map every jurisdiction's prescriptive building code around the world for the maximum permitted building height you can build with a single exit stair. There are some countries with no limit, South Korea and Switzerland, for instance. And then we see Canada at the bottom with the city of Chicago, Uganda, and Pakistan. And so the code change request that we submitted and is now being developed is looking at 3 to 6 story buildings. And that's around the range that you see in many, many other jurisdictions around the world, with literally thousands, if not millions, of these apartment buildings in their housing stock. Next slide. Now, when we look at the comparison to the acceptable level of risk and level of safety in our Canadian building code, the maximum size of building that you can design with 2 exit stairs is the diagram at the top. You can have a maximum travel distance from the furthest unit of 45 meters to one of those two stairs. That means you've got a 90-meter long hallway with two 6-meter dead ends. When you look at exit capacity, you can have up to 275 people per floor, and there's no limit on the number of dwelling units. So that's the level of safety that our code assumes when you provide two exit stairs. And again, we're not talking about just deleting one of those staircases. The conditions that we're looking at for single exit stair in the Canadian context are very limited occupant load per story, less than 10%, or about 10% of the two exit, a limit on the number of units, and a travel distance of 6 meters to that exit stair. And so fundamentally, from the basics of building design, these are safer buildings. Next slide. And then there's some Americans that are really interested in this too, and of course they needed to compare it to something easily understandable for dimensions. So you see the relative footprint compared to a football field. Next slide. Now this is maybe a new idea well, apparently not this room, but certainly 3 years ago it was a new idea to the Canadian context. But once you start digging, it turns out that in 1984, CMHC had done a research report on this where two very experienced architects had gone around and written and documented the differences in apartment building design. In 1993, Eb Zeidler, who's one of Canada's most eminent architects, wrote about this, that the fact that if we're looking at main streets, major streets, 6-story apartment buildings, beyond parking minimums, which have since been removed, the next biggest barrier is the requirement for two exit stairs and how it will impact these buildings. And then it turns out that in 1995, the Ontario Building Code collaborated with the City of Toronto Fire Department, with the City of Toronto Building Department, and the Ministry on developing the recommended code changes for missing middle and main streets housing. I invite anyone to go read that document because it is a fantastic laundry list of everything that should have been done. Many of those recommendations were implemented. Single exit stair was not, and partly it was because the home building industry said, well, we don't build this scale of buildings, so this isn't really something that we're interested in. Now clearly today, because we've done the zoning reform, we've removed the parking minimums, that conversation is vastly different. And so it is very important for the home building industry to say to government, to say to the ministry, that this is a priority and that this is a problem for your projects. Next slide. The other thing, I'd gone down to the US, there was a symposium with the NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association. Imagine a room of 150 fire chiefs in uniform and hats and a couple of nerdy architects. It was an interesting atmosphere in the room at the time. And one of the data scientists from the NFPA had brought up this slide, which looks at the historical fire data on death rates by housing type in the United States. The Canadian data, we don't have very good data in Canada, or at least we don't make it publicly available, is not much different. But what you look at is the death rate per million housing units in houses is just about under 25. 3-story to 4-6-story buildings is 5. So it is statistically 5 times more dangerous to live in a house than to live in a small apartment building. Now, that's not saying we should get rid of the fire safety requirements that we have for our apartment buildings, not at all. But it is to say that from a public policy perspective, doing things that mean you will replace a bungalow with a 3- or 6-story apartment building is in the public's best interest and increases the net fire safety of Canada's population. Next slide. So we submitted a code change in 2022. The National Code works on a 5-year cycle. I am now part of the task group on single egress for the code cycle. I can't speak to media about what that group's doing. That has to be referred to the media secretary. All I can say is that it is a strategic priority for this code cycle, and the next edition of the National Building Code comes out in 2030. However, at the end of the day, the jurisdiction lies with the provinces. Ontario's minister at the time, Steve Clark, said in 2022 this was a strategic priority. Paul Calandra, when he was minister, said this was a priority. We're now in 2025. I have not seen any of the reports being made public on this. A public consultation was supposed to happen in November. It was rescheduled for December. It was then suddenly canceled. We had an election in Ontario. We've had a building code update. and yet it's still crickets from the ministry and crickets from the province on this topic. When in 2022, they were the only province in Canada saying that they were interested in this. And since then, we've seen Alberta say that they're going to work on this. We've seen BC go ahead and change the code. And we've seen many, many jurisdictions in the US lead on this as well. So next slide. So after submitting a code change request and seeing the pace at which code development happens, a lot of fire engineers and building code consultants across Canada said, you should look at performance-based design, which is to not follow the prescriptive, acceptable solutions in the code, but to demonstrate how a performance-based design provides the same level of safety. And so we collaborated with 10 other architects in different provinces across the country who all had a project that was either not a piece of land that was not feasible or a scissor stair building design that they didn't like, and were really interested in trying to do a single stair design. We also worked with the city of Edmonton. That's a case where city council passed a motion, the fire department and the building department sat down together, hired a local architect and fire engineer. They wrote a report which provides a guidance document so that any builder in the city of Edmonton has confidence that if they submit a single stair alternative solution, following the methodology of the guidance document, it will be accepted. And Toronto did this for laneway suites when there was an issue with fire hydrant distance being more than 90 meters. So there's precedent for doing this. And City Council in Toronto passed a motion instructing Toronto buildings to develop a guidance document for alternative solutions for single stair. It's been, I think, a year and a half since that motion, and nothing has been done to develop that document. Next slide. So again, this is what an objective-based code is in the Canadian context. We updated our code in 2005, and so since then, whenever you come against a prescriptive building code issue, you work with an architect and a fire engineer to develop a performance-based design that meets a better level of performance. Next slide. Yeah, I just got through that. Next one. So we did a set of pilot projects across the country. They're available at singlestair.ca. You can track. They've all submitted for permit at this point. Some of them have received their response. 2 have been approved. 1 was rejected. It was a 5-story building, and the city of Hamilton said, if you cut off a floor and make it 4, we'll approve it. A really weird comment to have received in that sense, because the level of performance at the 5-story level had additional measures that at 4 stories it wouldn't have had. So you can follow along the progress on these pilot projects. It's interesting to note the way in which they're being received, the way in which they're being approved, the timelines across the country varying significantly. And of course, they range from a 3-story triplex to a 20-unit, 6-story apartment building. Next slide. The one that we worked at LGA was a 3-story, 10-unit building in Toronto. 10 units, of course, because that's under the site plan approval limit. And it's an affordable housing project for a community land trust. Next slide. And so what was interesting is on this particular lot, we were building an as-of-right building. The development industry would generally, a market builder would build a row of 4 stacked townhouses because it's 100% saleable floor area. You might get, 4 one-bedroom units on the ground floor and 4 upper 3-bedroom units. In this case, we were looking at doing rental housing. They wanted it to be a 100% accessible building with a little Lula elevator. And by showing the difference between what the market would otherwise build as stacked towns and what we were able to show with 10 units in a small apartment building, we're adding also 4 extra bedrooms, 2 extra units, an elevator in the exact same overall building footprint. Next slide. And so this is a quick summary of that alternative solution. We're sprinklering a building that otherwise wouldn't be sprinklered. We're upgrading the fire separations. We're upgrading the performance of the door. We're having really limited travel distances. We're slightly increasing the width of the exit stair. And most importantly, we're limiting the finishes in the corridor. And if you go to any sort of hotel or apartment building and you see a carpet in that corridor, you better pray that there's no fire starting in that hallway because you've got a combustible floor surface in it. Perhaps if we limit the finishes that we have in our exits and in our corridors, that's a better performing building. Next slide. And one of the last points, and this is beautifully documented in the 1984 report that went to CMHC, is that when a staircase is directly accessible from the apartments, when people know where that staircase is, when maybe they use it on a daily basis, that also has an impact on the psychology and safety of the building because it is familiar and it is being used. When you put an exit stair behind a steel door 90 meters down a hallway, it's unfamiliar, it's not being used on a daily basis, and it is, perhaps less safe. Next slide. So then beyond the pilot projects, we also did 6 prototypes. This was to understand a bit of a generic cost benefit, not sitting it on any particular lot or dealing with particular client conditions or approval processes. And so we looked at 4 stories, 6 stories, and 3-story Part 9 building designs ranging from 4 to 22 units. Next slide. And then we looked at the delta between in that same building footprint doing a 2-stair building, compliant with the National Building Code, versus single-stair design based on the recommendations of fire engineers over the past 18 months. And you can see the difference is that you're adding an extra bedroom on each floor of the building, you're getting more daylight and fresh air. In some of the cases, you're putting an elevator, you have the flexibility to put an elevator in where otherwise you simply would not. And you're also getting accessible dwelling unit layouts where you otherwise would not. And so we'll jump into 3 of those in a bit more detail. So this is a generic scheme for a 4-story apartment building, 6 units in it on a 33-foot wide lot. Next slide. Here you're seeing, again, 6 units, 2 bedrooms with the elevator and the staircase in the middle. Again, the occupant load, the number of people anticipated to be living in this building is drastically lower than what the code allows for 2 stories with a single exit. When you overlay, next slide, the current code requirements of a scissor stair, which also if you fall down a scissor stair, you're falling down 17 or 18 treads. Compared to a single stair, you've got a mid-landing, so your trip and fall hazards are drastically reduced. We're seeing a floor area efficiency delta of 10%. Now, the more important metric really to look at is construction cost and net operating income. Sometimes the additional mitigating measures for smoke control, for sprinklers, mean the construction cost is not actually going down that much. It may just even be neutral. But the real benefit is over the lifetime of the building, the additional rental income, because you can see that the footprint of that scissor stair wipes out one of the bedrooms and a lot of GFA in one of those units. And so you're going from having 2 bedrooms to having one of those be a 1-bedroom on each floor. What does that do to the net operating income of the building? What does that do to the overall pro forma? Next slide. Then we looked at a 6-story building on a 66-foot wide lot. Next slide. Here again, with single exit stair, you're seeing 4 units on each floor level, ranging from 2, 3, and 4-bedroom units. Next slide. When you overlay the minimum prescriptive requirements of the National Building Code, you see the floor area efficiency goes down by 5%. Construction cost does not decrease that significantly because of the smoke control measures at 6 stories that we're talking about. But again, net operating income goes up by 7%. Now there's been discussions about removing the GST, the federal GST from your pro formas. Single exit stair has the same impact on overall building feasibility as removing the GST. That's really significant for a building code requirement when you're looking at it from a public policy perspective. Next slide. And then the last one we'll just talk briefly is a 50-foot wide lot with a 3-story Part 9 building and 8 units in it. Next slide. So here you've got a 3-bedroom unit facing the back, a 2-bedroom unit, and a 1-bedroom fully accessible unit. And in this case, we put a little Lula elevator because we thought, why not? Next slide. So if the elevator is kept even in a prescriptive design, you're seeing the scissor stair be added in. You're basically condemning that 1-bedroom accessible unit to be the world's smallest studio. That, of course, has an impact on the net operating income of the building. But the next slide. What generally would happen is people simply wouldn't put the elevator because in Part 9 and 3-story buildings, you don't require an elevator. And so sometimes the benefit of single stair goes to more generous units, more bedrooms, better floor area efficiency, more rental income. Sometimes it's about creating the space for a courtyard, for more daylight, for cross ventilation. Sometimes it's about creating the space for an elevator and more accessible units. That's really up to the building design, but the code needs to provide that flexibility. Next slide. And so we then indexed across the 6 prototypes that we looked at. What were the findings from a project feasibility perspective? On average, you're seeing a decrease in the Part 3, so 4 to 6 story building designs of a construction cost decrease of somewhere around $75,000. In Part 9, because you're sprinklering buildings that otherwise wouldn't be sprinklered, you're seeing an increase. And of course, there's been some frustration from home builders saying, oh, really, I don't want to sprinkler these buildings. So let's compare what the cost of sprinklering is to providing 2 exit stairs, not just from a construction cost perspective, but then also from an annual income perspective. Because if in 1 year of annual rents, you can pay off the upfront construction cost of having sprinklered it, I think the conversation is over. Next slide. And then the last piece to really push cost-benefit analysis to the level of understanding that you can really talk about what is the impact of a code requirement, we looked at residual land value. And so the delta on a 10-year sale price at a 4% cap rate ranges anywhere from $200,000 to $1.1 million in the difference in how much you could pay for the land up front between whether or not it's a 2-staircase or a 1-staircase design. I think this is the first time that anyone has ever done a building code cost comparison impact analysis to the degree of analysis of residual land value. And certainly for people in the codes world, we had to explain to them what RLV stands for. Next slide. And then CMHC, being a lot of economists, had sort of asked us, could you please tell us what is the housing supply impact to the Canadian economy of single exits there? And you know, our heads exploded and we sort of said, we're architects, we don't know how to do that. But we know Toronto, we know the multiplex bylaw, we know that major streets and 6-story buildings are coming. We could look at what the potential housing supply impact would be of single stair in those areas within urban areas. And depending on how you look at the housing projections, at what rate we would be building this, you know, we know that in a 3-story multiplex, single stair adds a bedroom on each floor. We know that on a 6-story building, it adds a bedroom on each floor. So we could project that on an annual basis, it adds anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 bedrooms to the overall increase in housing supply. Next slide. And so single stair, something that 3-4 years ago was not understood and not being discussed in the Canadian and North American context, has now, you know, they've passed state bills in several US states. The International Building Code, which is like baseball, a really arrogantly named American thing. They're looking at changing the code to go to 4 stories. In the Canadian context, there's the 2030 code development process. And so there's a map that a savvy American put together to sort of track as this moves across the country. Next slide. So through a lot of these discussions with architects, with builders across the country, with fire engineers, we've also had people say, you know, single stairs is really important, but here's some other things that we keep running into when we try to build a multiplex, when we try to build missing middle housing that don't really make sense to us. And then we've got fire engineers on the call saying, well, we've actually done alternative solutions to solve this. And then I'm on the call going, well, why hasn't any one of you submitted a code change request? Given that the code takes 8 to 10 years to develop, why haven't you submitted a code change request for this? And they go, oh, you know, that would be a good idea, but no one's paying me to do it, so I don't have time to do it. So one of the issues is non-combustible sidewalls. If you're building close to a lot line, a house, you can do it in wood frame, no problem. But as soon as it's a triplex, steel studs, concrete and masonry. Well, if we had a performance-based code, we would define the conditions in which you could use any material to build it close to the lot line based upon a level of performance. And so someone needs to pay someone to write a code change request to deal with this issue. That will increase the ability of panelization and prefab building. That will decrease the carbon emissions in upfront construction and reduce your construction timelines because you can build with one system the entire building. Next slide. One of the other discussions is the delta between North American elevators and elevators around the world. What you're seeing in the corner here is the cost of the exact same elevator in Italy and New York City. For some reason in North America, it costs 3 times more to put the same elevator in. And so if we have a goal of increasing the overall accessibility of our housing supply, we need to not just look at regulating that, but also at why the cost of doing accessibility is so much higher in North America than other parts of the world. And part of that comes from the requirement for a stretcher in the prone diagonal position in an elevator in any building over 4 stories. And that makes sense in a hospital or a high-rise or many types of conditions, but a 4-story building with 8 units, maybe not. Next slide. And then the last piece, and this is electrical code, not building code, is the way in which our codes do load calculations, the way in which our hydro distributors determine when you need a pad-mounted transformer. Inevitably, what that means is that most multiplexes default back to doing natural gas for most of their building systems. And so if we've got a goal as a country to go towards electrification, to reduce the carbon emissions in the operations of our buildings, why does our electrical code inherently incentivize defaulting back to natural gas to avoid a pad-mounted transformer? There are load management systems, there are ways of updating our load calculations, there are a whole bunch of things we could be doing in the electrical space to build all-electric, low-carbon multiplexes, but our regulation right now is not making that easy. Other provinces are looking at this far more seriously than Ontario. Next slide. And so one of the interesting things that happened last year was environmental defense, and a wonderful gentleman, Robert Eisenberg, asked LGA, and we collaborated with SVN architects and planners, to put together a document to basically write a laundry list of issues dealing with mid-rise construction. A lot of this applies to multiplexes in Part 9 as well. And how can we make these legal, practical, and cost-effective to build? Next slide. And of course, what was interesting about that was you have environmental defense, an organization with certain views, and developer builders coming together and agreeing on the same points. That's pretty unusual and pretty remarkable when it happens. And of course, we broke that document down into 5 sections: planning policy, taxation and DC charges, building code, infrastructure, site servicing, construction capacity. This might be the Maslow hierarchy of needs of housing. Next slide. And this, I think, is the most important piece in the whole document. And we copied this from a guy in the United States that is really put together this fantastic analysis of the relative construction cost per square foot, single-family, low-rise, and mid-rise multi-unit. And the fact that it's the direction of the arrow that I want you to notice. Economies of scale are supposed to work the way that when a building gets bigger, the relative cost per square foot at least shouldn't go up. And in other parts of the world, it doesn't. So why in North America do the relative costs per square foot go up when we get more economies of scale? That makes no sense from a basic, physical principle. And so this document tries to debunk and demystify some of that. Next slide. And so with that, I'll just say thank you. I know that was probably way too much and way too short of a time period. The last slide, if you go to the next one, actually. Yep. So a lot of architects might be out of a job soon because the fact that I could take that little diagram and throw it into AI, and 2 minutes later it spits out, this sort of an image, which is a half-decent rendering of what a little multiplex on a corner lot might look like, means I think, frankly, a lot of architects should be becoming architect developers and try something new. I was at LGA for the last 3 years. Friday was my last day with LGA. And am now going to follow down that pathway myself as well. So thank you very much.